Hi Bernhard, next
Hi, Carsten.
video.
Correct. This one is going to be an interesting one, in my opinion, because
Yeah, it
we are
is.
talking about fault tolerance for AVD, right?
Yeah.
So remember when we kicked off this series, we had the planning session where we talked about the fault tolerance and some considerations for the deployment for Azure Virtual Desktop, how it will land on, whether you have a single site cluster or whether you have multiple clusters, right? And what
Mhm.
comes with that. So first, we do some slide work in order to explain a little bit in pictures what we are uh, want to talk you through, and then we are trying to implement it, and then we are demoing it from a user perspective. Okay. So so we were talking about this scenario here in the previously in the I think it was the
One of the
first
first,
yeah,
one of the first sessions, right?
right. The beauty of this scenario is, I mean, if you have multiple clusters, right, that you know, pull up in different rooms, for example, for fire tolerance, right, or it can be even different sites, right, on a campus, for example.
Yeah.
Um,
Or Bernhard, or you
yeah,
have many users and they
right.
don't fit in one cluster, and
Yeah,
you have multiple clusters for your session
right,
hosts.
right,
This scenario is also feasible, but
right.
you look at it from the fault tolerance perspective, right?
Perspective.
Yeah.
Right, because that's what you want to have is still want to serve your Azure Virtual Desktop users if a cluster goes down. That can be
Mhm.
for maintenance purposes, but also for disaster kind of thing, right? So
Mhm.
can you sort of spin up a fault tolerant environment for that spans across multiple clusters? Probably is the question to survive a
Mhm.
cluster failure, right? Or a cluster outage. So this is the level setting or the scenario, right? But there's one thing that we don't want to have, right? Which is a dialogue presented to the user that would look like this, right? So maybe
Mhm.
you talk me a little bit about through why you don't like to have that kind of experience
Yeah,
for a user perspective.
so we were working with workspace for our one cluster, the car R2 cluster. If we add another cluster that is maybe in a different location, different room, and we deploy the same applications there, maybe the same session host, image, and so on,
Mhm.
and we would have another workspace. So the user will be presented with two or even more, if you have more clusters, even more workspaces with the same application in it, and the user has to decide which one to choose. Yeah, and if you want to have a bit of,
Yeah,
let's say, um, evenly usage of the resources, you have to say the first user. So you click on the one in the first one, and the
mhm.
second user the second one, and so on.
Yeah,
Yeah, but that's not what I like. I want to see one
yeah,
session desktop, and we have a kind of load balancing behind it, right?
yeah. So to be precise, right? So you could configure just a single workspace that hosts um, two host pools, right? However, what you still end up is having two icons here, right? So the
Yeah.
first one for session hosts on cluster one and the second one for session hosts on cluster two, right?
Right.
I mean, if it's, one workspace or two workspace, it really doesn't differ, right? Because you would end up the user to decide on, which cluster is online or offline, right?
Yeah.
So maybe not a good experience because it's the system, still chances are that some of your users may end up trying to connect to a cluster that is down. However, you could argue then, hey, as AVD is fast enough, right? So we have seen that maybe if this cluster is no longer available, then go to your AVD configuration and just remove that workspace from the user's visibility, right? So delete it maybe, right? And it will, however, maybe not a good haptics for the users, right? So
Yeah.
I think what we would love to have is something like this, where you have just one desktop or one desktop to click at, right?
Mhm.
And maybe a single workspace that spans across a cluster or multiple clusters,
Yeah,
right?
that's what I want.
Okay, so but that would mean, right, that for the artifacts for Azure Virtual Desktop, that we only have one Azure Virtual Desktop host pool, right?
Mhm.
And having one AVD host pool means we would have session hosts that live on, both clusters, right, on cluster A and cluster B, right? So there are still, some of the desktops there, and if this cluster goes down here, right, I mean, these ones will be still up in green and could be connected to, right? And the load balancing mechanism for AVD would redirect the users that are clicking on this one here, to that one. Okay. Maybe not a nice painting and not a
Oh,
nice
I
user
like it.
experience.
It's better than better than I would do it for
Okay.
sure.
Right. But we need to prove how to set that up, right?
Mhm.
So basically what we have in mind is the following thing. So we create one single resource group in Azure, which contains the Azure Virtual Desktop artifacts. And here's a
Mhm.
little bit about, the naming convention that we are using for it in order to make things clear for the Azure administrator, what that really means, because it's not a single cluster now. It's the artifacts under this, could be living on cluster one or on cluster B, right? So we do have virtual machines or desktops already created on cluster number one. Um, and that's what you did you prepared that step, right? So we'll have a look at it. But what we do in this exam now, or what in this video, is to add additional hosts or desktops with another portal wizard run on the second cluster,
Mhm.
right? And I think, yeah,
The first step, the blue one, we showed when we deployed our host pool and then our
yeah,
session hosts multiple
right,
times. So now I would say I take over, but
yep.
first I have to add my video, my screen. I hope it's the right one. Yes, it is. And here we go. So I'm
Yep,
here in the virtual desktop pane, you would
yep,
say. So if we look here at the workspace, we have
yep,
our VS dash multi-cluster workspace.
right.
In the resource group,
Hmm.
multi-cluster AVD.
Hmm.
Here's our host pool.
Hmm.
And we have one application group where our application,
Okay,
our session
yeah,
desktop is living, and we already
yeah.
gave
Assigned
the
users to
right
it.
some users to connect
Yeah,
to it. So if we go to the host pool here
right.
and get this out of the way, we see already the 5 machines
Hmm.
that are up and running
Hmm.
here that
Hmm.
are in the first cluster. This is the blue part. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, and now I want to add another 5 session
Hmm.
hosts on the second cluster. So I can add
Hmm.
in the host pool additional machines, and many of the fields are already filled in, and I can't change them. So
Yeah.
it knows already which resource group, what's the host pool name, where does it
Hmm.
reside, desktop pooled, and so on. And I go to the virtual machines.
All
And
right.
here now we can use the name prefix. And of course, we tested this.
Hmm.
So we choose another name prefix for our
Hmm.
machines because they are AD joined, and we have to have um, a unique name. And we will talk about this
Talk
naming
about that.
convention when we kick this off, right?
Yep.
So
Okay.
I will not deploy the machines in Azure. I want to do it on one of our um,
Hmm.
Azure Stack HCI clusters. And now here I can choose a custom location. And over the custom location, we can address the cluster. And
Hmm.
we have already our machines deployed in this cluster over this custom location. And this is our second one. Ignore the third one here. So I take the second one.
Hmm.
And now I select an image that we have on the cluster. And here is our custom image that we deployed in in the other nodes. I take the same one, and now I have to specify some informations, how many VMs, how many processors or virtual processors I will have, how many memory, what is the network the machine should use here. This
Mhm.
is depending on the cluster. Yeah, we have it
Mhm.
here. And we want our machines to join the domain. So I will use,
Yeah.
I will
So I'll
use,
let you, while Carsten is typing, let me just, give you some advice. I mean, it's, although you could specify a completely different sizing for the desktops that live on the other hosts, I would discourage you to do that, right? I mean, you want to have a comparable user experience, whether the users land on cluster number 1 or whether they land on a virtual machine hosted on cluster number 2, right? So don't make it, too different. To be honest, just keep the settings as similar as possible, right?
right.
Um,
I do the exact same local admin account, and we provision the machines in the same OU in the
mhm,
Active Directory.
mhm,
Of course, I should not talk while I type. Then this happens, of course.
mhm,
And I do it again. This is the thing with the complex passwords, right? Hey,
mhm.
unbelievable. So now don't talk. I find this is the hardest part, 2 times typing the right password. Okay, so I fill this in. We don't
Mhm,
use tags. Now he's checking something.
mhm,
Important thing is we have the same resources. That's right. We have a different name for
mhm.
our different name prefix.
Yeah.
The other things seem correct, so I kick off the create.
Mhm. Okay.
So let's
So
go back
just
to the slides. Huh?
yeah, just make sure that I mean, what we definitely did we prepared the second cluster a similar way as the first one. So we downloaded an image, or we placed the custom image that we want to use on this cluster as well. And we also created the same network, the logical network definition on this cluster as well, right? So
Yes. It
just
has a
make sure
different
that you have,
name, but it has
yeah,
the same
yeah.
information in it. Yeah.
Yeah. So while this is running, we can spend some time maybe talking a little bit about the naming convention, and then there is another thing is which we need to talk about a little bit. So this is currently on the deployment. Maybe a little bit about our naming convention, not too fancy as I would say, but maybe helpful if you need to consider come up with a naming convention. So from the namings, we are using the cluster name or the cluster number where we place our desktops on, right? So the first letter is for the cluster, and then the number. Then we specify whether we want to use desktop for the full desktop hosting, or whether this machine is being used for application hosting only.
Mhm.
Then we specify a little bit if this is a personal, a dedicated desktop, right? Which means a one-to-one, I, Bernhard Frank, always get the same desktop, or is it like a multi-session desktop which can be shared by a lot of users at the same time? And then we also go maybe for a version which can be the image version.
Mhm.
If you have subsequent images or updates to the image to reflect application updates, update patches or whatnot, then it might be also good to reflect that in the computer name as well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit too complicated, but I think it might be
Yeah.
helpful. Okay.
It's just an idea. We are not people who deploy 2,000 session hosts on, let's say, 100 clusters or so. So, but there are customers out there, and I think what we show here is a
Mm,
nice start if you have more than 5 session hosts or more than 20 session hosts. Yeah? If you have more than
yeah.
200 users, they will not fit in one cluster, I assume, or
Right.
even 50. Okay,
Next.
so
Yeah. There is
over
one more
there.
thing I want to talk about, which is, remember that picture here.
Hmm.
So we have, the session hosts which are split up on two clusters now. However, what about the profiles, right? So in the in everything that we have set up so far, for the multi-session hosts, we have configured FSLogix,
Hmm.
meaning and how would that work in a environment where you have suddenly two clusters, for example, right? So in order to have fault or resiliency for the user profiles, it's a very nice thing because you can also split up the scale out file server onto these two clusters, right? So here you have node number one sitting on cluster number one and node number two sitting on cluster number two. So with this or doing this, you always make sure that you have at least one path to your scale out file server ready and available for your desktops to connect to, right?
Hmm.
And I think
That's
that's
an
maybe an elegant way of getting resiliency for the FSLogix profile as well, right?
Yeah, and that's the beauty of storage spaces direct. So we have a high available storage system.
Mm-hmm.
Every node, VM1 and VM2, has all the data, has a copy of the data, and the
Mm-hmm.
data is stored in local disks. So we can even we don't need a, let's say,
Yeah,
a ZAN loon or something that
right.
both share. Every data is in every VM, and so we can also back up
Yeah,
the VMs with a normal CBT. So
yeah.
every information is in the VM. You can just back it up like you do any other virtual machine. Very
Yeah,
nice.
the only thing is, I mean, for storage replication or for the data resiliency or storage spaces direct that lives inside of these VMs to work, I mean, just make sure that you have, that there is network traffic going on
Yeah,
between these two VMs, and it can be massive, right? So it shouldn't be a 1 gigabit connection between these two VMs. Don't do it. I mean, do something which is capable of transporting more data, right? Because
really true.
yeah,
So
um,
should we have
yeah,
a look into the cluster?
hmm
Okay, so how is this all done? So here you see the failover cluster manager, good old tool that is there forever now.
hmm
And you see we have two clusters here, our cluster one and our cluster two. And here
hmm
in the roles, we see, for example, one of these scale out file server storage
hmm
spaces direct nodes. Here's one,
hmm
and the other one is in the other cluster. So here's the other one. Yeah. You
hmm
also see our five session hosts. They are already deployed here. We also have
hmm
some testing machines because we will create logins to this
hmm
machine. We will show you later in the video how we play with it. And in this cluster, these session hosts are deploying in the moment. So
hmm
these are created, and I also have here some test machines. So it's a nice setup. In the moment, they are, to be honest, they are on the same rack, but it wouldn't matter if they are in different rooms on the same campus, for example. And you can also use this scenario to, if you said, I have many clusters and I want to spread my session hosts over multiple ones. Okay, so now we have to wait for the finishing
deployment.
of the
Yeah.
deployment. So it will take a while, and so we will pause the video maybe
hmm
and come back when our session hosts are deployed, Bernhard. Oh?
Yep. Perfect.
So, Bernhard, we are nearly done with the deployment and our hosts are already accepting logins, right? Should
hmm
we switch over to your screen? Here's
Yes,
only
please.
the Azure monitoring agent is the
Missing.
last
Yes.
step of the
Yeah.
registration.
Yeah. Yeah. Switch over to my screen,
I
please.
will, I will.
So as you could see here, now we have the following 5 session hosts that sit on cluster number 2. You could also tell that by um, by the looking at the location flag as well, right? So this is the custom location. So these guys here are sitting on cluster 2, and these ones are, sitting on cluster number 1. So we do have a split scenario, if you wish, or a multi-cluster setup. And also we already see some users are already connecting to it. So maybe let's do a refresh. Yes, and we started out, with cluster number 1 getting users. So you see a little bit more users sitting on cluster number 1, but the load balancing will kick in, and we will see more nodes or more users to be, distributed to the ones on the second node as well, right? So that looks good in my opinion.
Mhm.
So I think we should try to simulate a failure, to be honest, right? And then still see, how long the system will take in order to detect that. And
Yeah,
if I can still log on as a user, what do you think?
we can do that. Yeah. So I switch back to my screen.
Hmm.
And here we see the user logins running,
Hmm.
but you forced me to show something, and that is a blue screen on a whole cluster, right? So I have to log
Right.
in because they automatically log me off
Hmm.
or
Yeah.
yeah. So I installed a little tool that has a funny name. It's called Not My Fault,
Hmm.
and it's from in the Sys internal suite, or in you can
Hmm.
download it from Microsoft from Sys internal.
Right.
And this is a tool. I assume it's from Mark Rosinovich, and he has a kind of humor. I think this is a tool for operating system programmers or system programmers where they can create different problems in an operating system. For example,
Yeah.
memory leaks,
Thanks.
various hang statuses, and also crashes. And the default that is pre-selected is a kernel mode high ERQ fault. That's an immediate blue
Okay.
screen. So if we want to see that, I had to have to use a BMC to connect to the console, but I haven't do that. So you have just to believe me. And when
All
I do
good.
a
I mean, if you go to the failover cluster manager, then and see the node down,
we will see
that,
that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and
Okay.
but the nodes will do a memory dump. They have 512 gigabytes of memory, and then they will
Right.
come up again. So I
Mm-hmm.
have to walk over there. If we
Mm-hmm.
don't want them to come up again, I have to turn them off. What
Mm-hmm.
would you say? Or do we have enough time to not do that?
I don't know how much time it will take to write the dump and
So
then
I
come
walk,
online.
I walk,
Okay.
and you will share your screen. So when I press
Okay.
crash
Okay.
here,
Hmm.
there's
Yep.
no answer asking, do you want to crash? They immediately crash.
Okay.
So if I go back to the cluster,
Hmm.
we should see here in the cluster, we should see now
You
I
crash
crashed those
cluster.
two, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or didn't I crash them? Yeah, RDP is gone. That's a good sign. The cluster needs a bit of time to recognize that they are really gone. Yeah. Can also use a ping maybe. So they are not pinging. I will turn them off, but before that, I
Hmm.
share your screen.
Okay. Yeah. So let's go back here and see, these ones. And AVD already picked up sort of that some of the session hosts are no longer available, right? So heart beating doesn't work, and I would assume that the other one is coming as well and marked as unavailable. Okay, and while this is happening, right, let me try to log on to the system and see if I still can log on. And as you could see here, I get a prompt and I get the log on, and I'm probably connected to one of the remaining session hosts living on cluster number 1. So even with the German language, as you could see here, host name. And you see here, I am located on cluster number 1 by the number, and node number 4 on this one, right? So I would say, quod erat demonstrandum, we still could, sort of provide the users connectivity to the desktops, although they were clicking on the same icon or same dialog, regardless of it. And I think, that was sort of the mission accomplished. What do
Yeah,
you think?
so I think so. Well, I turned them off. I didn't see what you are doing while I'm gone, but I assume it
Yeah,
worked well, right? So
right. I
all
mean,
the,
we do have definitely, some sessions that are maybe lost on these ones, right? So
yeah,
the work of the users, so they definitely, it was a blue screen. They won't be transferred automatically to somebody else. So, I mean, you need to educate them in order to tell them, hey guys, you need to, spin up another connection because it was definitely gone. But at least the system or some of the they need to do a relog on, and they will be diced out to a new
yeah,
host. Yeah, and once the system come back online, they should be able to continue with their work, right?
yeah.
They may have lost some of the data, which was in memory at the time when the blue screen happened, but profile data and that kind of stuff should be still available.
Cool. So this concludes our video.
Yep.